Welcome back to Retire Southern, where we share authentic experiences and meaningful connections from the heart of the American South. Our message is simple. Life is too short to wait for someday. Don't wait for retirement to start living. I'm your host, James Lewis, and if you've ever strolled Charleston's cobblestone streets at night and felt a cold shiver crawl up your spine, chances are today's guest put it there. He's Charleston's premier ghost tour guide, a spinner of dark tales, and proof that history isn't always resting in peace. He's a native Charlestonian. His pleasing terrorist ghost tour is rated 4.8 out of 5 stars based on over 1,300 reviews across Viator and TripAdvisor. He offers 2 tours nightly, 363 nights a year.
Yes.
$30 for adults, $15 for the kiddos if you purchase online. And most importantly, when you book Mike, you get Mike. Mike Brown, welcome to the Retire Southern podcast.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I actually went on your tour back in October and loved it, wrote about it, been telling people about it, so hopefully you're getting a lot of good volume. But as you and I were just bantering around before I hit the record button, is it pretty consistent year-round for you? Or obviously I would think you'd have more activity in the spooky season, but is it a pretty consistent customer flow?
Well, there are always tours going out, but we do have busier months and slower months. Obviously, October is one of the busiest months because of Halloween, which is sort of like the Black Friday for ghost tours.
Awesome. Well, I thought we could start with a little bit of your background. You served in the U.S. Navy during Operation Desert Storm.
Yes.
How did your military experience shape your approach to storytelling and touring?
Well, the time I was in the Navy, one thing about, because for example, during Desert Storm, we were deployed for 9 months. So in the Navy, when you're out at sea for that long, you get a lot of time to read. And that was where I really developed a big interest in history. And it was the interest in history that led me to want to become a tour guide when I got out of the Navy and returned to Charleston.
So you've been guiding ghost tours for over 20 years now?
Almost 30 years.
Almost 30 years.
Well, 30 years of touring and 28 years of ghost tours.
So were you initially drawn to the ghost stories, or did the stories find you?
Well, I guess I would say they sort of found me. I was initially drawn to history tours. Specifically, back then I was a real big Civil War buff. And it was while I was researching some of the local Civil War history that I stumbled across a ghost story. And that was when I really got fascinated with the ghost stories.
So what was the ghost story that hooked you?
There was a group of U.S. Army officers that were POWs, and they'd been captured in a battle and then brought to Charleston and imprisoned in a building called the Old City Jail, which was, in addition to housing the regular criminals in the city, it was being used to house POWs during the Civil War. And these officers were attempting to escape one night, and while they were trying to dig their way through the wall of the jail, one of them saw a woman in a white dress walk down the hallway. And that story kind of fascinated me because it was something I never really thought about before, the ghost stories. And so I started doing research on it, and it's a well-known Charleston ghost story nowadays, but about a woman named Lavinia Fisher. And so that was where it's the mix of the history and the folklore and the ghost encounters. I love how those things come together.
Now, I might be wrong about this, so correct me if I am, but the Old City Jail, are they converting that now into a condo or an office building? Or?
They have renovated it recently, and so the jail has 3 floors, and so each floor serves a different function now. It used to be, not too many years ago, that the whole building was open as sort of a haunted jail tour. But now the haunted jail tour is confined to the ground floor of the building. The second floor of the jail is now rental office space. And then the top floor of the jail, believe it or not, is a wedding venue. So people have wedding receptions there now.
Okay. Amazing. People mention that you're surprisingly modest, and you are, given your acclaim. Has humility helped you connect more deeply with your audience, do you think?
Well, I don't really think of myself that way. I am more appreciative of people on my tour when they tell me that they listen to the podcast, or I can see that they are enjoying hearing the stories. That's where I get most of the satisfaction from, is seeing someone else enjoying the experience. And certainly with the podcast, I'm very appreciative when people come on the tour and they tell me that they've listened to the podcast. Because as you know, when making a podcast, you're sort of working in the void a lot of times. And you don't really necessarily have a lot of interaction with the listeners. And so when somebody tells you that they've listened to it or that they like a particular episode, or even if they're getting on me because I haven't put out an episode in a while,
right?
I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And so the podcast is also called the Pleasing Terrors podcast.
Yes.
And that's available on Apple, Spotify.
Yes, all the regular places.
Anywhere you podcast, everywhere you podcast. So what is your process for weaving together, the history and the folklore and the ghost story for your tour? Do you have a process for them?
Well, usually it'll begin with something like an idea, and it'll just be the very first episode of the podcast that I ever did was about a haunted hotel in Los Angeles. And what caught my attention was there was a kind of a famous video of a woman named Elisa Lam who was disappeared from that hotel. And she was in the elevator, and that was the last time she was seen, was in the elevator. And I watched that video, and it really gave me the creeps. But what really caught my attention was I noticed that she was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt. Mm-hmm. And then that made me think of Little Red Riding Hood. And so later when I went and started researching and writing the episode, I mixed the story of what happened to Elisa Lam in this haunted hotel and the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. And those are the kind of stories that I like to tell.
So I've been on your tour, and I find it fascinating. I'm a little bit fascinated by the paranormal and obviously history. But you use photos and visual aids on your tour as you're going from place to place. And I'm not going to give anything away because I want people to come on your tour. I want people to book your tour. But you do weave everything together. But as far as the images that you use go, is there one image that you think really grasps like the audience or like really pulls them in or makes them gasp?
Well, there's a famous ghost photo, probably the most famous ghost photo in Charleston, which really tends to make an impression on people. And it's one that I show at St. Philip's Graveyard. Mm-hmm. And the story is about a woman named Sue Howard who tragically lost her baby when she gave birth. This was back in 1888. And she died. She got sick and she died just 6 days later. And so there's a photo that was taken 99 years to the day from the day that the baby died. And it shows a woman, what appears to be a woman in a kind of a hood and a gown, kneeling in the graveyard over this particular grave. And what's interesting is that Sue Howard and her baby were both buried in the same grave. And so it looks like a photo of Sue Howard mourning the loss of her child 99 years after the child died. And so that's a picture that tends to make a big impression on people.
So I specifically remember that moment on your tour. It is a spellbinding, eerie, it's captivating, the photo. And the amazing thing to me about that, it was literally 99 years to the day of the death, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was incredible. Your delivery, and I've witnessed this, is described, and I've seen it, as underplayed yet suspenseful. How did you develop that tone or that cadence, or is that just who Mike is?
No, it is intentional. One of the things that I worked a lot on when I started giving ghost tours was the problem of how to make the stories creepy or compelling, and not just be, talking about kind of like any history tour. I'm just sort of blurting out the information. But one of the big things I do, there's a concept that Edgar Allan Poe actually talked about. It's called unity of effect. And this is something that I try to do both with the podcast and with the ghost tour. And that is when you're putting together a ghost story, you figure out the ending first, and then you work backwards from the ending so that you always know exactly what you're heading to and you don't wander off on any tangents. And then once you know where you're going, then you can try to adjust how you present it in order to sort of build up as much tension as you can. It can be difficult sometimes because especially with walking tours, as you can know from when you went on my tour, you're not in like a nice quiet auditorium.
Right.
You're out in the world, and the world is going on around you. And sometimes the world cooperates and it's quiet and the atmosphere is wonderful. And sometimes people are honking their horns and heckling, yelling boo as they go by and that kind of thing. But so part of it is necessitated by having to be heard and speak clearly. Mm-hmm. And so I maybe talk a little slowly because of that. And then part of it is just trying to talk in such a way that it doesn't break the atmosphere of the story.
Yeah. I mean, how many times has like just a group of like Citadel cadets or just like the horn coming by? I mean, how often is your tour kind of like, broken up by unwanted sounds?
Oh, it's not really broken
hecklers?
up. It's just, and Citadel cadets, by the way, are, in my experience, the most polite and courteous group that you could encounter in a tour.
Perfect.
A random bachelorette party is
it's much more dangerous.
Is orders of magnitude more likely to be disruptive than a group of Citadel cadets.
That's hilarious. I could totally see that. A bachelorette party is much more dangerous than a group of Citadel cadets on a lot of levels.
I've always told people the best group I ever had on the Ghost Tour was a bachelorette party, and the worst group I ever had on the Ghost Tour was a bachelorette party.
That's funny. Which ghost story or legend in Charleston do you think is the most misunderstood?
Well, there's two. One is the Lavinia Fisher story, because that is Lavinia Fisher is, in Charleston folklore, considered to be the first female serial killer in the United States. But that is a very complicated story with a lot of angles, and the further you get into it, the more the story changes. And there are a lot of big twists and turns to it, and so it's not quite that simple. And, when you're giving a tour, by necessity, the stories have to be short. And brevity is not the friend of complexity in storytelling. And so a lot of times it just gets broken down to something very simple. Lavinia Fisher is a serial killer, and the story is not that simple. And even with me, sometimes I can't get into the whole story. That's one nice thing about having the podcast, is that when I do touch on really complicated ghost stories or bits of history, I can talk about part of it on the tour, and then I can always say, if you want to really do a deep dive on this and see a whole different angle to the story, you can go listen to the podcast.
That's great.
So that's one way the podcast and the tour work well together.
That's really cool. Well, you mentioned there were two. What was the
other one? Would be Annabelle Lee. Another famous Charleston legend is that Edgar Allan Poe's Annabelle Lee, from the famous poem, his last poem, is based on a real Charleston person that he knew when he was stationed here in the Army in 1828. And again, that is a story that's very complicated, and there's a lot of angles to it.
Yes.
So it is, I would say, just from what I hear of other tours walking around at night, you hear a lot of versions and variations of those stories in particular, and some of them can get pretty outrageous.
Yes.
And I will sometimes hear interesting details being added to the stories, and I wonder, where did that come from? But those would be the two most misunderstood, I think.
Have you ever had a moment during a tour when something genuinely unexplainable happened, whether it was a sighting or just anything?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a gate, you may remember it, there's a gate that we visit on the tour for the Unitarian.
Yeah, I was going to say the Unitarian Cemetery. Okay.
So between 2013 and 2021, 64 people on my tour passed out in front of that gate.
Really?
And I was going to that gate before 2013. And I've been going to that gate since 2021. And I don't know why it started when it did and why it stopped when it did. But during those years, it would happen consistently, almost every month. And it would usually happen the same way. We would go over to this gate and stand in front of it, and I would start talking. And within a minute or two, somebody would get wobbly and either drop or somebody would catch them. And we would take them across the street to the steps of the Charleston Library Society, and we would set them down. And as soon as we got them across the street, they would just snap right out of it.
Really?
And they described pretty much the same thing. They said that they felt fine until they got in front of the gate, and then they said it felt heavy. That's the word they would use. It felt heavy. And that was when they passed out. And it wasn't... I had someone come on the tour that had that happen to them, and they immediately left the tour afterwards. I think more from embarrassment than anything. But maybe a year later, they came back on the tour again, surprisingly, and they went to the gate, and they had no problem the second time.
Interesting.
So it's not... it's just if you have the right person at the right spot at the right moment, something like that can happen. And that is by far the biggest weird thing that's happened on the tour. I'm glad it hasn't happened in a while.
So you said the last occurrence was 2021?
2021.
Okay.
I still get people on the tour that will take me aside after the tour, and they'll tell me, hey, I didn't pass out, but I felt nauseous when we were in front of that gate, or I felt weird in front of that gate. And I will, admit that there can be an element of it being psychosomatic, that people just get caught up in the story, maybe. Sure. But it happens a lot. And when people were actually passing out, it was just happening too often for that to be the case.
So going to the tour specifically, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, you offer 2 tours per evening, 7:30 at night and 9:30 at night. And the tour lasts about 90 minutes, each tour. So how much ground do you cover during that 90 minutes?
Well, distance-wise, just a little over a mile.
A little over a mile. So, I mean, as far as age groups, right? I mean, you have kids, adults. It's not... If you're thinking that, it's a mile uphill, in the snow, it's not. It's
no hills in Charleston.
No, yeah. It's a very flat, pleasant, pleasing walk through the city. So you don't have to be... in CrossFit or an ultra marathoner to go the distance with Mike
No,
Brown.
It's very easy paced. Okay. The only environmental problem you can run into with the tour is like maybe in August when it's just really hot and humid here. But other than that, it's a very comfortable, very easy walk. And during the hotter months, I'll provide water to people and do whatever we can to mitigate that to some extent. But generally, people don't have too big of a problem. And we have, age range on the tour from toddlers to seniors.
Right. So all are welcome.
Mm-hmm. People in electric scooters or wheelchairs. It's all very accommodating and very easy.
Yeah. So you do an amazing job, I feel, of setting a hook at the beginning of the tour. Not going to give it away. And then coming back and... So we start in Washington Square at the Ravenel House, and you go to places like Pugin's Porch and the Charleston Library Society, like you just mentioned, multiple cemeteries. Which location gives you the most chills?
Well, certainly what was happening at the gate at one point would definitely do that. I would say also there's a place called, which sometimes I can get to and sometimes I can't. It just depends on how efficiently the tour is moving on that particular night. But there's a place called Philadelphia Alley, which is also one of my favorite spots on the tour because it's this really beautiful alley, and it's a place that feels kind of secluded. You step into it, and it's like you're just in this little pocket away from the rest of the city. It's very immersive. It is very historical looking. It is very beautiful, but it's also very creepy looking at night. And it has a pretty dark history to it, at least in Charleston folklore. The legends are that there were duels that were fought there at one time. People have gotten some really creepy looking photos there that they've taken of things in the alley. And I remember back when I was a teenager, that was a place where there were no lights in the alley at the time, and it's about a block long from one end to the other. And there used to be a thing to do where you would dare someone at night. It'd be pitch dark, and you dare someone to, run from one end of the alley to the other through the dark. And that was a thing back in those days. But yeah, I would think that's a place that I find beautiful, but also kind of creepy at the same time.
So I have to ask this because he lives in Charleston. He's a co-owner of the Charleston River Dogs. Has Bill Murray, the original Ghostbuster, ever joined one of your tours?
No.
He is not. Okay, had to ask.
I saw him and his family get on a carriage tour many years ago, but that's the closest I've ever been to Bill Murray.
Closest you've been to Bill Murray. So you've been featured on HGTV, BBC, Voice of America, Ghost Asylum. Which media appearance surprised you the most, and why?
Well, I would say the one that I found most interesting was that Ghost Asylum show. We went to a place called Fenwick Hall, which is actually outside of downtown Charleston. It's an old plantation. And what's interesting is that plantation has a lot of legends attached to it about pirates and smuggling and whatnot. And when we were there, they were able to actually show us like the smuggling tunnel that they used to use to... I'm not sure what they were smuggling in or out. The legends say it was pirate related. Mm-hmm. So maybe, there's probably rumors of buried treasure and whatnot. And that's kind of an interesting property too, because it has a headless horseman ghost story. It's an old story about the wealthy daughter of the family falls in love with the stable boy, and the stable boy the father finds out and he's infuriated, and so he has the stable boy killed, and he has his head chopped off, and so people will see the headless stable boy riding through the property at night, supposedly. But I've never been able to really tell that story very well because the stable boy's name was Tony, and I've just never been able to wrap my head around Tony the Headless Horseman.
That's hard. That's difficult. He was of Italian descent. Old Tony the Headless Horseman. Ghost Asylum, speaking of ghost hunters and ghost hunting, if you could ghost hunt anywhere in the world, where would it be, and what would you hope to find?
I probably like one of the castles in Edinburgh or somewhere else in Scotland that have lots of ghost stories attached to them. That would be neat to be able to spend the night in one of those. Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity years ago to spend the night alone inside the Old City Jail here, and it'd be great to have that chance inside a really old castle or something. I hear Edinburgh is a good place to do a ghost tour. Okay,
yeah, actually, that was gonna be my next question. So after guiding all these tours over almost 30 years, and how many podcasts have you recorded? Over 50, at least?
No, it's sitting at 44 right now. I keep kind of in a weird schedule with my podcast episodes. One of the things that I like doing a lot is the research. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I kind of made a decision a while back is I didn't, if I were putting out an episode every 2 weeks, I would only be able to really talk about things in a very superficial way just because I wouldn't have any time to really research them. And so I prioritize doing lots of research and really trying to either present a story in a way that it's not been presented before, or even better, find some new piece of information that hasn't been discovered yet. And so I can take a long time working on an episode. I'm getting ready to start releasing a new series of podcast episodes here in the next few weeks, and I've been researching it for 2.5 years.
Oh, wow. So as far as first-hand experiences you've had, you just mentioned spending the night in the Old City Jail. Mm-hmm. Did you have any kind of experience or encounter during that evening?
Well, the night that we were there, one thing that happened was that the last tour of the night that they were giving in the haunted jail before they left me alone, I saw somebody get attacked.
Really?
It was January of 2017, so it's a small group because January is a very slow month for tours. And it's cold, so everybody's wearing jeans and sweatshirts and whatnot. And so it's a small group of people, maybe 6-7 people. We were standing at the bottom of the staircase inside the jail. And one of the things that you hear about happening in the jail is people will get scratched. And it's always like 3 parallel scratches. And so we're standing there, and there's a teenage girl in the group, and she, out of the blue, just starts screaming. And she grabs her leg. And her mother pulls her into another room, and then comes back a minute later, and she's taking a picture with her phone. And there were 3 parallel scratches down the inside of her daughter's leg. And like 15, 20 minutes after that, I was all alone inside that building. And fortunately, I didn't get scratched, but through the course of that night, I could hear voices. I could hear people talking. If I was on the ground floor, I could hear them talking on the second floor. Or I could hear a door opening or closing, these creaky old metal doors. Or I could hear footsteps. And that was really creepy, especially when you were there all by yourself.
Did you stay the whole night?
I stayed the whole night.
Okay.
But it was scary.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Which story or tour memory stands out as deeply meaningful, even if other listeners just thought it was another ghost tale?
Well, a while back, I did an episode, or series of episodes, under the title The Mermaid Returns. Mm-hmm. And that one meant a lot to me because that is a story about an African-American woman, an enslaved woman, and the story was purposefully buried back in the 1940s. So it was intended, one of the catchphrase of the podcast and of the tour to some extent is some stories were never supposed to be told.
Right.
And honestly, when I first came up with that, I just thought it was a cool sounding slogan. But I had found in that particular story about this enslaved woman a real story that was never supposed to be told. It was a story where somebody had sort of written over it with another ghost story. And that was the story that wound up being published in a book, and that was the one that people knew. And so, but when I was reading that story, I noticed that the author would pause periodically and say, well, you may have heard this, but this isn't true. And then later on, you may have heard that, but that's not true. And I kind of extracted all of those things he was saying not to pay attention to out of the story that he was telling. And the story itself is kind of a Frankenstein story where this crazed doctor back in the mid-1800s is digging bodies up out of graveyards in an attempt to resurrect the dead because he's fallen in love with a ghost, and he's trying to create a body for this ghost so that they can be together. And that story was, as it turns out, was fiction, and it was hiding a much darker story, one that Charlestonians did not want to be told. And in fact, the author of this book of Charleston Tales was a guy by the name of John Bennett. And when he had first uncovered this story, and he was from Ohio, so he didn't know any better, and he uncovered this story back in the early 20th century, and he gave a lecture, and he was actually ostracized from society for having even mentioned this, and slowly was able to work his way back into Charleston's good graces. But that was one that meant a lot to me, to be able to find that story and have it brought back to light and tell it.
That's great. So what legacy do you hope to leave for those who walk Charleston's nighttime streets after one of your tours?
Well, I've always thought that I would be really pleased if someday in the future somebody who has an interest in Charleston legends and Charleston ghost stories would be able to, go into a historical society or a library or something and, find a dusty old, I don't know what it would be in the future, I guess a dusty old computer file or something instead of a folder.
Thumb drive.
When I go research things, it's always in a folder in the archive section of the library.
Right.
But yeah, I guess in the future, I don't know if it's going to be a thumb drive.
A hologram, maybe.
Yeah. But you'd be able to go to something like that and to find some of these stories that they're still around in the future and that people can go back and see them. I think that would be kind of neat.
And you may be doing this if you were going. You've mentioned writers. If you're going to write a memoir about life, death, the stories of Charleston, do you have a title for that? And you can't say Pleasing Terrors.
Buried Treasures.
Buried Treasures. I like it. So if you could retire anywhere in the South, where would it be, and why?
Well, I asked my wife that question not long ago, and she said she would like to live somewhere up around Asheville, up in the mountains.
Asheville, North Carolina.
And I where she goes, I follow. So that sounds good to me. And honestly, I've, always, for the most part, except when I was in the Navy, I've always lived here in Charleston. And there are, everything's very flat here. It's beautiful. I love it. But because of that, maybe it's just because it's different, I do have this kind of fascination with the mountains. So I think that would be nice for a change.
So I have to ask you, because I'm staying here this week at 56 Cannon Street, do you think there's anything happening here as far as paranormal activity, haunting, anything I need to be worried about?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me.
Okay.
I'm often more surprised. I don't know the age of this particular building, but I'm often more surprised to hear that there aren't stories with one of these older houses than I am to hear that there are. And certainly with a place like this that's probably undergone some significant renovations over the years, it would surprise me if there wasn't a story here.
Okay.
You do have things turn up every once in a while. Every once in a while I'll get someone on the tour that lived in a place like this or that did some work on a place like this, and they'll share some things with me on the sly about things that happened to them.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep my eyes and ears out. So we're now going to move on to the gift portion of the show. Anyone that is a guest on the Retire Southern podcast gets to pick a hat. Each hat has its own persona or character. So I'm just going to go from left to right. The navy and khaki hat I call that one the classic. And as you can see, there is a Retire Southern patch on the front, and Southern character is embroidered on the back. There is the coastal, which is a light blue and white, and then the campfire is the green and black. So which Southern character persona are you?
I think I like the classic.
You're the classic man. All right.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah. So I was going to thank you all for listening to Retire Southern. You can find this episode and more on our website, retiresouthern.com. Follow us on social media at Retire Southern, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, remember, don't wait for retirement to start living. Mike, thanks so much for stopping by this afternoon. I'll see you in Washington Square.
Thank you.